I hope you're doing well. Of course, I'd like to take a moment and say thank you so very much for joining me today. In Hebrews chapter 1, starting in verse 1, we read, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And then in verse 4 we read, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a much more excellent name than they. So the Hebrews writer starts chapter 1. Of course, a very, very good place to start. The very beginning starts chapter 1 of Hebrews by introducing the Hebrew reader to Christ. Well, how does he go about doing that? He says in verse 1 that God spoke at various times in various ways. He says in times past he's spoken to the prophets, spoken to the fathers, our fathers, through the prophets. So the Hebrew writer says, all right, look, in the past we've had prophets that have spoken to our fathers. But in verse 2 we see that now, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has spoken to us by his Son. Of course, his Son being Jesus Christ. Notice what we read in verse 3 about that Son, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. The brightness of God's glory and the express image of God's person. The English Standard Version would read, he is the radiance and glory of God. He encapsulates the radiance and the glory of God. Not only that, he is the exact imprint of his nature. He, Jesus Christ, is the exact imprint of God's nature. That's another translation that we might read, and for what it's worth, I like how it said that, the exact imprint of his nature. So Jesus is the exact imprint of God's nature, the brightness of his glory, notice this, and upholding all things by the word of his power. He, Jesus Christ, upholds all things by the word of his power. We read, when he had by himself, purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Jesus Christ died for our sins. After he did that, of course, he died, he was buried, he was raised up 3 days later. But after being raised, after ascending into heaven, what did he do? He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. But we notice something. Having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a much more excellent name than they. It appears that the Hebrews writer was saying, it's a possibility that you might get this Jesus confused with just another angel. And the writer says, no, he is the Son of God. He's the Son of God. He's how God speaks to us today. Of course, now we have the Bible. But not only is he the Son of God, he's the brightness of his glory, the brightness of God's glory, the radiance of his glory. Not only that, he's the express image of his person, that is to say, the exact imprint of God's nature. Not only that, he purged our sins, that is to say, he died on the cross for us. And then after that, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. What other angel could do that? Not a one. So we see in the first 4 verses of Hebrews chapter 1, we're introduced to Christ. We see that he's the Son of God. He's how God spoke to men in these last days. We also see that he's the brightness of God's glory. He's the express imprint or the express image of his person. That is to say, God's person, God's nature. Not only that, he died for us, he's purged our sins, but he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, and there is where he is today. That's what we see from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.